2 months ago, TheActMan made a Yu-Gi-Oh video. So if you're unfamiliar with TheActMan, he's one of those gaming YouTubers. They're growing in a vat somewhere. Listen, I watched a lot of JonTron in 2011, but even I can't deny that Rockington and his consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Now everyone thinks they can make nuts and bolts. JonTron can't even make nuts and bolts anymore. What chance do you have? Anyway, you know the drill. TheActMan is a YouTuber for normies with a 1 million sub fan base, so you can take a wild guess as to the video's contents. Hard text too long. Game too complicated. Does anyone else for kids lay censorship? Has anyone here watched Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged? Why are you permitted to activate interrupted kaiju slumber while there's a kaiju on field? The prohibitive effect of existing kaijus is almost identical to the text on there can be only one, and yet it's Pot of Greed. Okay, I might have slipped one of my own in there. It's not even a predictably bad video. Like, it's got all the trappings of this, but it's also got some weird grievances that I have never heard another person vocalize. There's some pretty rudimentary editing errors.
Fit the dark theme of the story's plot. Initially, dual monsters.
And he's included like 7 minutes of footage lamenting how irrevocably broken the game is because Predaplant Chimera Rafflesia is strong and Gravity Bind don't work no more. Despite completely disagreeing with him on a fundamental level, I can't help but feel at least a little bit of sympathy for TheActMan. I know this video was like his white whale, something he felt like he had to do, and it got so big, so unfocused, and so out of his control that he had to upload some version of it just to get it out of his head. The end result is a directionless ramble that jumps around pretty much at random between the show, the game, a bunch of Yugi-tubers disagreeing with him, and rants that would have been overplayed in 2011. So is this video just one more in the established canon of dumb bitches confused by Pandalham monsters? Yes. But it's also something a little more important. It's a cultural barometer that we as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community can use to measure how normies see our hobby. And hopefully it can also serve as a roadmap as to how to get more people on board with dual monsters. This is a joke from his video. I would never be cringe in my own work. Whoa! This is the most incredible scientific discovery yet! Have you heard of ovipositing? As I'm sure you're all familiar with by now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Did not start as a card game. Originally, Yami Yugi, the spirit of the pharaoh, took over Yugi's body to punish evildoers using shadow games, usually ironic tests relative to their crime, and then would banish them to fucking hell when he inevitably won. One such shadow game included a card game modeled after Magic the Gathering. People ate that shit up, and after repeating that shadow game a few times, the publisher decided, fuck it, and restarted the series with dual monsters as the main focal point of the story. Suddenly, we've got a pretty big problem. The game, basically designed to be a Magic the Gathering ripoff, now has to have rules, has to be playable, and more than anything else, has to be balanced. The Duelist Kingdom arc does a pretty good job of explaining why this is a poor base from which to build a card game. The rules aren't ever fully explained, cards just sort of do whatever they want, and often it plays more like a tabletop than like a card game. The story is still interesting and compelling, but the associated product isn't. Then, in the second arc, Battle City, an in-game character says, "We are now following the rulebook," which coincides with written instructions for the in-real-life game. Finally, we have arrived at Yu-Gi-Oh! And it sucks. The first few years of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game are bland as all hell. A lot of summon, lodge in, and pass, followed by this, followed by this, followed by the first good format, GOAT. But because the game was designed from game one to be a Magic the Gathering style ripoff, the gameplay reflects it. Despite a lack of lands, games are slow. They're wars of attrition. Flashy combos are few and far between. The format might be good, but there's nothing giving Yu-Gi-Oh! An identity distinct from its source material. Then, finally, in 2008, something changed. Yu-Gi-Oh! Stumbled upon two things: the first modern-style combo deck in Dark Armed Dragon, and the first successful archetypal deck in Gladiator Beast. Over the next decade and change, Yu-Gi-Oh! Design would mostly retread these two design principles. Archetypes prevent decks from looking samey by rewarding specific decks with broken tools, and flashy combo decks available from the beginning of the game finally differentiate Yu-Gi-Oh! From Magic. You can start spell slinging the second you sit down. No awkward 3 turns of land pass required. These design goals were represented in the anime as well. Different characters in GX and beyond play archetypal, combo-oriented strategies, and archetypes become a shorthand for a character's personality. Which brings us to today. And mostly... So when people make these videos, "Oh my god, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is ruined forever, trust me, someone who watched an episode of the show before I developed object permanence and then made this video 20 years later," they usually complain about these things. Yeah, I mean... duh. This is the one we hear the most, and it shocks me because it can only come from the type of mind that can't eat chicken nuggets unless they're shaped like dinosaurs. When you played Yu-Gi-Oh! In the schoolyard, you were probably doing so with an incomplete understanding of the rules and a card pool composed of commons you pulled from a vending machine in Pizza Hut. Back in the day, it was hard to find cards. You had to scour eBay or Gathering Grounds or Mike Loda for the privilege of buying a single rare card for $10. These days, access to cards is good enough that even kids can make something decently competitive just by using their lunch money. If you've got an issue, take it up with the passage of linear time. It's 2023. Sonic the Hedgehog is in theaters, Mario's nipples are out, and a 7-year-old is beating your ass with a $6 Fluonderese bill. Yeah, you're right. As card games age, it's hard to think of new cards that do shit that no other card has done before. There are a couple of ways to solve this. First, if your card game is designed for limited play, you can stuff boosters with bad cards that are a boon to players in draft formats. Second, if your card game has set rotation, you can print similar cards for new formats or lower-powered versions of existing cards. Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have either of those things. As a result, every single card in every single set has to be both powerful enough for people to feel good dropping cash on the new set, and do something that no other card has ever done before. Text bloat is out of control. Here's a graph of the amount of words on average a card has over the years. Of course, it's not really as bad as it seems. A lot of the words on cards aren't important. For an example, let's look at this clip from TheActMan's video.
This is the perfect example of what I'm talking about. If you boil this card down, it has a summoning requirement. It has 2 effects when it's summoned, and 2 effects while it's on the field, and an effect when it goes to the graveyard. One card that does 5 things.
He says there's way too many effects on this card, but there's really only like one effect you need to keep track of as part of a board state. The remainder are summoning conditions. Even actual effects like piercing or hard once per turn are common enough phrases that you'll just be able to skim after a few games. Still, I think this is one of the best criticisms of Yu-Gi-Oh! Deciphering a game state and playing optimally is really hard. Now, I think that's okay. I'd like to reward skill in onboard decision making, but it can certainly be intimidating for new or returning players. Sidebar before we move on, please stop showing these cards when you're talking about cards that are too long. These cards are not good. You look unserious. There's plenty of long-ass cards that saw play. You don't have to make them up! This one's nuanced. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an exceptionally complicated game. If you're a Magic the Gathering player, I'll explain it like this. We only really have one format, and it's Legacy, and that comes with all the same baggage. Corner case rulings and finicky weirdness from 2001 does matter, and it comes up a lot. Learning how to effectively wield the text on Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards often feels like learning a new language. But like a language, once you're fluent, you really do have the ability to use your knowledge to navigate anything your opponent has thrown at you. However, what people claim is complicated about Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually isn't. Here's the fast effect timing chart. This can be simplified too. If you have reached an open game state, the turn player has the first opportunity to activate a quick effect. Missing the timing can be simplified to optional trigger effects cannot trigger if they meet their condition during a chain resolving. Hand traps are just monster effects that discard themselves from the hand to the graveyard as part of their activation cost. Hearing these complaints feels like hearing people complain about the rules of Monopoly. Oh, so when you land on a property owned by another player, you have to check the card to see how much you owe. Though you owe double rent if they own all the property. And if they have a hotel, this whole thing goes out the window. Oh, and God help you if the property's unowned. Like, yeah, don't worry, the rules cover this. To me, a large part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is using your ability to decipher game states to manage massive outplays over opponents who aren't paying as close attention. Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't like all games in that it demands your full attention at all times. And that's one part of it that I really like. Mostly I hear this criticism from people who learned the rules by watching the anime. Obviously, that's not going to work. At some point, you're going to have to read. This is a take I didn't believe existed until I watched the TheActMan video. Let me play you a clip.
Hey kids, would you rather play the deck with the giant sea serpents, freaky fishmen, and hot mermaids? Or a deck that's based on French and Italian desserts or animal sounds? We went from menacing insects and hordes of zombies to cars? An archetype on cars?
The story of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is pretty compelling. It's a millennia-long struggle against the forces of darkness using ancient weapons adapted with modern technology. It's a story about cycles, about fate, about genetic destiny, about the indomitable power of the human will. It's also about the fruitiest man in the history of time day drinking and watching cartoons.
No more white wine spritzers before bedtime for me.
Your red wine spritzer, sir.
Merci, croquet.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a story about dichotomies. A generational breeding program spanning 10,000 years is almost capped by a guy from Brooklyn who likes rolling dice. The ultimate form of evil is trapped in the twinkiest frame imaginable and slung over someone's shoulder to beat a hasty retreat. A man consumed by hubris and ego is so enraptured by his own prowess that he builds a jet that looks like a Blue Eyes White Dragon. This is a goofy franchise. I personally found it exhausting that every Magic the Gathering set for years went to a new plane where the most important thing in the universe was happening and the most important people in the universe had to make the most meaningful sacrifice in the universe, like 16 times in a row. I think it's funny that we have an archetype of evil plush toys. I like the lesbian VTubers who moonlight as jewel thieves. The unexplained Wizard of Oz Star Wars mashup archetype is hilarious. I think it's awesome that people who like epic, powerful beasts and people who like funny birds on vacation can both find homes in playable meta decks. I think this one's just people being scared of cards that are a different color. I never really bought it. Fusion, combining 2 monsters to make a more powerful one using a spell card. Synchro, combining 2 monsters to make a more powerful one using a tuner. Xyz, combining 2 monsters to make a more powerful one using 2 monsters of the same level. Link, combining 2 monsters to make a more powerful one by summoning to an extra monster zone. Pendulum. Okay, I kind of get this one. This one lets you pendulum summon any number of monsters with levels between the 2 markers on your pendulum scales, but if a pendulum monster would go to the graveyard, it goes to the face-up extra deck and can be pendulum summoned to any extra monster zone you control. Thankfully, these are mostly defunct. We only get one good pendulum deck every few years. There's been much more time spent complaining about these cards than there ever has been playing with them. I think these endless videos about where Yu-Gi-Oh! Went wrong are easy to disprove. Attendance at Yu-Gi-Oh! Events has been increasing every year since 2011. Simulators like Duel Links and Master Duel are both extremely popular and extremely lucrative. Yu-Gi-Oh!'s in a renaissance of cultural impact with merch, cards, and cereal sold at big box stores nationwide after a decade of drought. But that doesn't do much about the people who think, that's all well and good, but I can feel deep in my bones that something is wrong with this. Well, here's the good news. You don't have to worry about Purpley Armageddon. The bad news is the slow, plodding, suboptimal Yu-Gi-Oh! You remember from your childhood never existed anywhere outside the playground. But if you still want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! That way, you do have options. If you appreciate the Game of Inches from back when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was just a Magic the Gathering ripoff, there's a large community of duelists and a large depository of decks on goatformat.com that chronicles the stuff that people were playing back in 05. If you want to play the cool combo style or archetypal gameplay Yu-Gi-Oh! Is famous for, but don't want to jump into the deep end of Xyz, pendulums, and links, check out Edison Format, another enormous online community. And if you want to experience all modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to offer, but don't want to spend more than a few bucks on it, check out Common Charity, with all the complex rules interaction and onboard puzzles characteristic of how we play the TCG with nothing but commons. Warning to the TheActMan, Predaplant actually is quite good in this format. And if you want to be able to practice on your own with no judgment, check out Master Duel or a free simulator like Omega. In the past 5 years, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has massively evolved, not just from a gameplay perspective, but also from a community one. It's become so much bigger, so much more inclusive, and so much less like a boys club for schlubby dudes that could afford a Dark Arm Dragon than it was in 2008. And I'd hate for someone to see a video like TheActMan's and think that there isn't a place for them in this honestly amazing community. As a final note, TheActMan concludes his video by lamenting how changes to what's considered a level meant that he couldn't play his favorite deck, Nurse Burn FTK. So don't treat his opinions about Yu-Gi-Oh! Like they have any weight. He was never really playing it anyway.